Praise the name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. We are here once again to study to show ourselves approved, to become a workman who need not be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. Welcoming you here to the J.T Kerr Memorial Baptist Church, where we still have a faithful gathering who are with us live and in person, and hopefully there are others who may be tuned in via the internet. We have been doing some general overviews of the Bible itself. We started out on last week. We tried to make sure that everybody is familiar with the languages of the Bible. The basic three languages that the Bible was originally, and we know that to be, and we'll say it out loud, that way we know it. The first one would be Hebrew, Aramaic, and then Greek. And at some points in time, we acknowledge that the whole Bible was put into Greek, called the Septuagint. And Septuagint comes from a word that means 70, because 70 Christian scholars got together and translated it and put it all into the Greek language. Because as we read the New Testament scriptures, we'll see that most of the people involved were Greek. The Christians were Greek. They were familiar with the Greek language, and it was dominant in Christianity. But I also told you that once the Roman Empire took over the Christian religion, they made it universal, meaning that the word Catholic itself means universal. That's where we get it from, the Roman Empire, universal, that word Catholic. So it was the Roman Catholic Church. And when they did that, because the language of the Romans was Latin, they translated the Bible into Latin. They pretty much expunged all of the other translations and made the religion, the language of the Christian religion, Latin. Almost to the point that they made it sound like that is the only language of the Bible. And for many centuries, even to this very day, if you are a Catholic, your basic Bible is still in Latin. When you go to your church services, they speak in Latin. The priest is speaking in Latin throughout the whole service. They do all of their services in Latin. There was a time in the Middle Ages when they would put people to death through some very agonizing death penalties, boiled in oil, put on the stake, burned alive for trying to translate the Bible into another language. Many people were victims of that, right on up to Tyndale, who had a Bible that the Pilgrims used when they came to America. They did not use the King James Version of the Bible. Those individuals who came on Plymouth Rock in 1620, I'm trying to tell you some things, but you can always look it up and Google it. But it was King James Version of the Bible didn't come out to about 1611. The Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock 1620. They already had a Bible that they had been utilizing that was translated by Tyndale. Tyndale, of course, didn't have a lot of authority behind him, and when he was captured, he was punished by the Roman Catholic Church. 1611, King James, actually, he had the authority of his whole empire. He was a king, he had his empire, and for the most part, the Catholic Church could excommunicate a king if he did not follow the tenets of the Roman Catholic Church. And if the country that he was emperor or king of decided to support him, he would excommunicate the whole country. And so what King James did and what the people of England did is that they became protesters of the Roman Catholic Church, and they became Protestants, meaning they would no longer yield to the Pope and the Catholic Church. They became Protestants, of which we are today, Protestants. We don't acknowledge the Roman Catholic Church as being the authority of God. Okay, questions, comments on that before I move on to another subject. I just want to make sure we understand how we got to where we are. People had to die for it to be translated into the common language of the people, which the Bible had already told us, that everybody should be able to hear God's word in their own tongue, as evidenced by the beginning of the Christian church, which took place on the first Pentecost, after the resurrection of Christ. I have to make that specific because they have Pentecost every year. They have Passover every year. So that first Pentecost following the crucifixion of Christ is when Christianity began. I know we like to think of the Christianity began with Moses or the Ten Commandments. No, that's not really true. Christianity is not birthed until Jesus is crucified and resurrected. And even then, it doesn't come to pass until he says, I'm going away and I'm going to send you a comforter, and he's going to bring everything I taught you to your remembrance. Everything I said, the things that I did, all of that will come to you now, and you'll understand it better, because you didn't really understand it when I was telling you. When I was walking with you those 3 years, you really, you heard and you went along with it and all of that. But obviously you didn't believe it all, because as soon as something happened to me, y'all got scared and ran away, as was evidenced by the episodes of Peter, who was the first one who said, yeah, you are the Son of God, the Most High. And as soon as something happened, he split and run. He's the man who's going to stay with Jesus the whole while. He did get bold one time and pull out his knife and cut somebody who was apprehending Jesus. That's biblical. That is scriptural. That's why oftentimes I say how Peter, who became the first official spokesperson for the church, he was very prone to cussing folk out and cutting people. Now, he would pull out a knife quick, he would cuss folk out, and it's evident. We don't have to make that up. When you read it, you'll see it. Questions, comments? We assume that most of y'all knew that, but we just want to make it lively. Now that we know that the Bible has gone through the languages, we have it now in our own tongue. We have to go back to the beginning and acknowledge that when the Old Testament was written and when the New Testament was written, they didn't have chapters and verses. That's normal for us now. We just assume that they always had chapters and verses. No, it was written originally in a scroll, rolled up in a scroll, and you had to roll it out to read it. And there were no chapters and verses. And so you wonder, how in the world did they read it? Well, as evidenced by some of the things that we read in the Bible, especially Jesus, it said he went to the place that he wanted to read. I'm sure he had to roll it out. And he read. There was no distinguishing chapters and verses. So individuals who read the Bible, who read the scriptures, they read they probably had some type of arrangement, said that we're going to read this portion, we're going to read from this book, we're going to read from this this epistle or whatever, but there were no chapters and verses. Chapters and verses don't even come in until modern times. That means the time of Jesus and his people. Just to give you a straight frame of mind, you have to understand that Jesus and all of his disciples and even his adversary, Paul, didn't have chapters and verses, but they all read the scripture. So they had to read from a scroll. They had to read from scrolls because they didn't have printed books that we have now. Printed books didn't come until 1500s. So we're talking about Jesus pretty much in the first century. And so we're talking about in the first century from 0 to 100, and the printing press from 1500 to 1600. So keep that in mind. So that means that the modern chapters were not even put in place until 1297. Well, 1227. I'm going to put it closer. Now, 1227, what's going on in the world? America has not been discovered by any European group except probably Leif Erikson, that nobody, documents. But 1492 is when Columbus sailed the seas. So 1227, way before Columbus, if we're putting it in a time frame, that's when a bishop named Stephen Langston, he was called the Bishop of Canterbury. And somewhere y'all have heard Bishop of Canterbury, because that's a very distinguished place now. In fact, the kings of England, all of them, at some point in time, when they go through their process of being ordained or installed or crowned or whatever they do, they have the Bishop of Canterbury. So that is a very distinguished office. So it was the Bishop of Canterbury in 1227 that went through the process of dividing the Bible up and putting it in chapters. In other words, distinguishing, because the person who wrote it didn't put it in any chapters. Keep that in mind. It was not put in any kind of chapters. Keep in mind, we still don't have any verses. We just have blocks of chapters throughout the Bible. And I always make this distinction. There are no chapters in the book of Psalms. There are 150 songs. There are 150 songs. A psalm is a song. There are 150 songs because Psalms is a song book. So they are not chapters, even though they are set apart just like all the rest of them. But if you know that you are in a song book, then you're not reading chapters, you're reading songs. Each one is a psalm. Psalm 1 is a song by itself. Now, it just so happens we don't have the music notation, so Reverend John couldn't play it because they don't have any musical. They somewhere in time, nobody kept up with the musical notes that go with their songs, but the book of Psalms is a song book. It's a song book, so keep that in mind. Whenever you hear somebody reading, they should not say the 23rd chapter of Psalms. They just say the 23rd Psalm or the first Psalm or the 100th Psalm. I'm telling you some stuff that just don't come naturally, that these are things that somebody has to tell you some point in time. Either when you're coming up as a little child in the Sunday school, they tell you these things and they become, they just come naturally over time, and you don't even know when you learned it or when you heard it. But yes, each psalm is an individual psalm. So 1227 is when the Bishop of Canterbury divided it up into chapters. Now you got to wait 300 more years before somebody is inspired to write it into verses. Y'all hear what I've said? 1551. 1551 is when it was divided up into verses. So by this time, and we began to see they're still at this point in time have not started to put everything into the printing press. Gutenberg's printing press would come in that century, but they had not started putting the Bible in place. For a time perspective, keep in mind that King James had the Bible translated and put into a form that could be put on the printing press. Keep in mind, by this time, it's already divided into chapters and verses. So when you have a published account putting the Bible in chapters and verses and put it on the printing press, that is why it was so well circulated that even today the Bible is still the most printed book. In fact, it's still the most, even though they give Bibles away, somebody has to buy them. So it's the most publicized, the most purchased book, because people who give them away, they purchase. They may purchase thousands of them, and they give them away free, but somebody bought them, so it shows up on the accounting that these books were bought. Can we get that concept? So they're still bought by somebody, even though people give you a Bible or whatever, somebody paid for it. What I want to let you know then is that chapters and verses are not divinely inspired. All right, let me say that again. Chapters and verses are not divinely inspired. Just because we got chapters and verses, that only means it makes it easier for you to read, but the word itself is inspired divinely. But somebody who came along and divided them up did not make it divine. In fact, they didn't do it right in some cases. They didn't do it right, meaning that if you take the numbers out of it and read it, you'll be fine. But if you put the numbers in, sometimes you'll see that they don't fit right. They did a good job because that's the only way we know it. But I can pick out some places where it just don't fit. They shouldn't have stopped there. They should have not let that chapter end there. It should have kept going if they wanted to do it right. But they did it for our convenience sake. I'm going to give you some classic examples so you won't say, well, he said that. I didn't say the Bible was not inspired. I said the way that somebody came along in 1227 and 1551 and made chapters and verses, they didn't necessarily do it right. Not saying that I could do it any better. I would just let it stay like it was and just read it and put a bookmark wherever I wanted to stop. But they made it convenient. And it is still very convenient, and we utilize that. The seminaries utilize that. They don't try to correct it, but they can visibly see where it could have been done differently. But we're not going to change it. I'm fine with where it is. Case in point, let's look in Hebrews. Find the Bible somewhere close by you. And I'll just show you, it always comes up every time I read this portion of, some of them come out right. But this didn't come out right. Unless, you can read it and make it right. But it just doesn't come out right the way they cut it off. And when he made these verses, I'm talking about Robert Etienne, who did this in 1551. If we look at Hebrews, let me give you a good example. The 11th chapter, 11th chapter of Hebrews. Now, keep in mind, if we didn't have the verses and the chapters, I will start reading at 10:39. 10, the verse right before 11:1. But we are not of them who draw back unto perdition. Everybody there? That's the 39th verse of the 10th chapter. But we are not of them who draw back unto perdition, but of them that believe to saving of the soul. Now, 11:1 says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for. Now, that's what he decided that he wanted to start this new chapter. Are we there? I'm trying to set up something. Now, that's a good place to start right at the word now. Now faith is, but he had to arbitrarily stop and start that there. But let's go all the way to the end of the 11th chapter, and I'm going to let you make your own distinction. The 11th chapter, beginning at ending at verse 39 and 40. Here's how it reads, 39. And these all, having obtained a good report, because all of those individuals from 11:1 are talking about their report of faith. And these all, having obtained a good report through faith, received not the promise, God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us shall not be made perfect. They decided to end it there. Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses. Now, this cloud of witnesses is everybody they talked about in the 11th chapter. Everybody they talked about in the 11th chapter, those are the witnesses. So I'm going to keep reading from verse 40. God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect. Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of God the Father. Now, if we didn't have chapters and verses, all of that would run together because it's the same subject. It's talking about the same thing. We just stopped it in the middle and decided that we're going to, but it doesn't sound different to anybody because we are accustomed to the chapters and verses. But if you took the chapters and verses out, you see that you are in a continued paragraph. And all of that goes together and is talking about the same thing. I mean, everybody's not going to see that, and some people don't even know what I'm talking about. But you haven't changed your subject. But you cut it off and you started a new chapter. When obviously all of this is the same train of thought, talking about those individuals who have gone through hard trial and tribulation, who were sawn asunder, who were burned at the stake, who lived in caves. And then it says, seeing we're passed about by a cloud of witnesses, we're still talking about those people. Why we cut that? What did we cut that off for? He thought it was a good idea. And of course, if you have been reading this before chapters and verses, they will question, why didn't he just keep that? That really continues. That should have been that 11 should have been longer. Chapter 11 should have been longer. That's just my feedback. You don't ever have to see that, but you do need to know that whoever divided, and we told you who they were, the Bishop of Canterbury and Robert Etienne, actually, they were about 300 years apart in their writings, in their deliberations. And I'm sure that Robert Etienne, of course, knew about the Bishop of Canterbury, because he was already using chapters by then. So all he had to do was divide it up into verses. I hope I'm not going too far over anybody's head, but I just think you need to know that so that you won't be ever confronted by individuals who think they know more than you and make it sound like Moses divided it up into chapters and verses. He did not. Okay? Since he is the first writer of the biblical passages, and he only wrote 5 books out of all the 66. He only did 5 of them. Okay. Questions, comments? Sometimes you get feedback, you kind of see where you're coming from. So if Moses is the original beginning author, and he had a narrative. He divided it up into 5 separate books, and they are called the Pentateuch, meaning 5, where we get the prefix for Pentagon is the same one that's in Pentateuch, meaning 5. That's where we get that from, 5 points, the Pentagon, and the 5 books of Moses being the law. And there's that section of the Bible is called the law. And it has 5 books, the law, 5 books of Moses. It's called the Pentateuch. It's called the Mosaic Law. There are 5 of them. He did not divide it up into chapters and verses. He just gave you 5 books. And each one was a separate scroll. So in essence, whenever you started reading a book, you had to read the whole book. Unless you said, we're just going to read until we get to an hour or so, and then we'll stop and we'll read the next time we'll read the next part. We just put a marker in there because we couldn't go back and say which chapter and which verse because we didn't have that. Okay, I'm just giving you some practical knowledge so that you can make the Bible real. This is not a mysterious book. God intended for us to have it. And then some people tried to come and make it more convenient. And it was accepted because it's, they didn't try to make improvements on the word. They just made it easier for you to access it. So you wouldn't have to go all the way to the beginning and start reading. Like I said, you're reading a scroll, you just read until you get to a point where you stop. Or you say, we're going to read until lunchtime and then stop. And then the next one we come back, we'll put a marker there and we'll start again. Wherein if you had chapters and verses, you say, well, we just start at chapter 5. And you have something legitimate to work with. Okay. All right. I think by knowing the languages of the Bible, knowing that they were in scrolls, knowing that they were translated, knowing that in the 1500s we started getting the printing press, and the first Bible that got widely distributed was in 1611 when King James put out what we call the King James Version of the Bible. Now, if you talk with some people older than me, they'll say that's the Bible. All right, and I'm going to say that again. If you talk with people older than me, and sometimes they don't have to be as old as I am, they will say the King James Version of the Bible is the Bible. All right, now, what I mean by that, if you read anything other than the King James Version of the Bible, that's not the Bible to them. So if you read another translation, they say that ain't the Bible. Because they want to hear, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. New translations don't say that. They will say something modern. Yes, I walk through a valley of the shadow of death. I will fear no evil. His rod and his staff, they're not going to use any ancient words. And so if you're not using any ancient words, then you're not using the Bible. In fact, there are some older people who did not get the kind of Bible study that we have. They just got somebody who told. They didn't know that. They assumed that Jesus is the one who divided up in chapters and verses. But the other thing, all right, that's for being funny, but the other thing is that they had the assumption that when you say yea and thou, that's how Jesus spoke. I mean, that sounds, kind of strange to us now. But older people who believe that the King James Version of the Bible is the Bible, you can't make it anything else. And if you use any modern words other than yea and thou and thou, whatever, you can see the words in the King James Version of the Bible are not the way we speak now. They believe that that's the way Jesus and his disciples spoke. We know that, no, that's the way King James and his contemporaries spoke. All right, do we understand that? King James and his contemporaries, who were people like William Shakespeare. In fact, he might have been one of the ones who helped write or helped translate it. And their wording is the same as you would find to be or not to be. That is the question. That's the same writer who is writing the Bible into the English language at that time. The English language now would not have yea and thou. Those are obsolete words, but because the Bible has already established this way, they have the New King James Version, they have an American Standard Version, they have the Good News Bible, they have the New International Version, the NIV, and it does not sound anything like the King James Version of the Bible. But if you don't hear the King James Version of the Bible, and if you're in a generation older than mine, then you ain't reading the real Bible. In fact, if you're reading it off your tablet, it's not the Bible. I'm speaking in, the truth in the way it is. That doesn't mean it's right, but that's the way they believe. There are still some preachers now that say you reading off a tablet or your phone, that ain't the Bible. Especially if they ask you to read and you read the New International Version, you're definitely not in the Bible. They might want to put you out of church. Okay. Question, comment. But I advocate that whatever version of the Bible is supposed to be in your language. It's supposed to be in the language you speak and the language you understand. That's what you use. Even in seminaries, they use the King James Version as the reference, but they generally use something like the New International Version, which is modern English. And in fact, some of the meanings of the words in King James Version of the Bible don't even mean the same thing. If we look in a dictionary may have several meanings for the same word. That's how they do. You might have 10 different numbers with what that word means at a certain point in time in history. The thing that older people were hung up on is when Jesus himself said it, because if Jesus said it, that's how he talked. I'm trying to tie it all together. This is how Jesus talked. He says, suffer the little children to come unto me and forbid them not. That's what the King James Version of the Bible said. That's how Jesus speaks to those people. So that's why they had a hard time deciphering that word. In the King James Version of the Bible, they are speaking their modern day English of 1611. And the word suffer, if you look in your Thorndike or Webster's dictionary, it says the word suffer has several different meanings. And our meaning today means that you go through hard trial and tribulation. That's what suffer mean, right? That's what we would, if you looked it up on Google, there's about 12 definitions for the word suffer. Somewhere along those 12 is going to be the word allow. Somebody look it up, Google it, and see how many words And the word that we have in the 20th century and the 21st century, the word suffer means to go through a hard struggle. But then you keep going down that list, it almost say obsolete, but it will say suffer means allow. And when Jesus said suffer the little children, he meant allow the little children. The older folk meant it mean make them suffer, because that was their understanding of it. That's why they gave children such a hard time. They didn't let children do nothing. Y'all didn't live back then. Y'all won't live in then. All right, and that's because of the fact that the meaning of the words of the 1600s, those words don't mean the same, but they are already translated and etched in stone. But anybody find the word suffer under Google and tell me how many definitions that you find for it? How many numbers? They should have a number of each meaning. All right. Now keep right on. If you go all the way down to about number 10, then it would say allow. And that's the original meaning in 1600, when King James had his men to write this. Right. But then go on further. It would change the whole concept of what it means. It has to be, somewhere it has to mean allow, because that's what the biblical purpose of it in 1600, allow. In fact, there's a couple of other places in the King James where they use the same word, suffer, and it was not talking about the children. It says, suffer them to come unto me, meaning allow. All right, see, in other words, it's nowhere else used but the Bible. And not just the Bible, the King James Version, because the New International Version would not have suffer in there, because suffer is not a word, that is an archaic word now, and the New International Version has to be relevant to this generation. King James Version of the Bible is not relevant in its English to the modern day person. So a person who studies the King James Version has to be an avid reader of the Bible. Now, if they want to learn more, they can use another supplement, a Bible that is of a modern translation, and also a concordance that will match up words, because if you're going by the words of the King James Version of the Bible without understanding that it's not the same meaning as 21st century, then you will be thrown off by a lot of things you read in the Bible. Okay, I think we spent enough time on that. I'm just trying to make some points, because these are points that you will have whenever you're trying to study the Bible. Those things will come up. All right, because we are here, I'm going to try to do something that if you continue to stick with it, then you will have a complete, I would say a comprehensive knowledge of the Bible. Now, reading the Bible, of course, there's no substitute for reading. You have to read it, but we know that we can divide the Bible up into sections. And I'm hopeful that at some point in time, I have given you a sheet that has those sections outlined. And if you don't, you can certainly get one tonight. The books of the Bible outlined, because what I'm going to do, I'm going to go through every book in the Bible and tell you something about it. Because the books of the Bible should not be mysterious. Some of y'all probably have this somewhere. Fine, if you got more than one, that's good. You can have one for this room and one for that room. realizing that that is what the children of Israel did. The children of Israel told the parents to write the law down. You got some more? Need some more? So write the law down and write it somewhere so it's on your doorpost. Write it somewhere you can have it around your neck. So anywhere you go in your house, you should be able to see some of the word of God somewhere. So that's what Moses told them to do. And the word told them to do that. And so anywhere you got it is going to be good. So the first 5 books of the Bible, we already said they were called the what? What's the 5-sided building that they already done started messing up? The new leader done come in. Said, no transgender people. You're already out. Made a decree. They're already out. They got to go through a process, but no more can come in. But the ones who are already in, they got to go. Now, there'll be some fights, but they're not taking any more. All right. Then he went on to say, well, that's a whole nother thing. Because here is what happened Monday. Monday, I had a meeting, and they had received a memo that said all the federal funds were frozen. So this agency that I was meeting with, they primarily, well, most of the groups that I am a part of a board on, they're for people in need, people in poverty. If you're cutting off federal funds, that means no food stamps. That means no help for Head Start, no help for child care. It's supposed to be Medicaid and Medicare. All of that's supposed to be cut. Now, that's what they said. All of it was cut. They sent the memo out. Then they came back because they got so much feedback and said, we didn't mean all. Said it shouldn't mean Medicare and Medicaid, and it shouldn't be food stamps. But by this time, all of the agencies have received it, and they're saying we got to cut our programs because we can't draw down any money. It's the last of the month. We can't even go into February. And then he put out something because he got some feedback and said, I didn't mean everything. Yeah. And so they're going back now and looking at something different, but he ought to mess people up. And the people who voted for him, they don't know that they got cut out too. Okay, let me get off them. That's political. So if we got the 5 books, they are called the Pentateuch. There are also, these 5 books are called the Law of Moses. And you've got that sheet. You've got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Now, each one of these, there's a reason why that word is called what it is. We can't assume that everybody always knows this, but you got your paper there. You can write down the word beside it about its origin. The word Genesis is a Greek word, actually, that means beginning. And you remember I said that the whole Bible was translated at some point in time into the Greek language. So that means if we were reading in a Greek Bible, the first word in the Greek Bible would be Genesis. I'm saying the first word would be Genesis. Now, it just so happens that they named the book Genesis, because if you read the book of Genesis in the King James Version of the Bible, the first word is in the beginning. That's what it says, in the beginning. So the first word of the Greek Bible, Genesis, which means in the beginning. And then they just named it Genesis. Am I confusing anybody? But that's why they call it Genesis, because it is in the beginning. That was the first word in the Bible when they translated into the Greek language. The first word is Genesis, and it wouldn't be written with a G-E-N, because that's not how the Greeks write, but it would say Genesis, because Genesis is in the beginning. So that means if you want to find out who the first family was, what happened, how did this start? All of that would be in Genesis. That makes sense. And it's set up that way. The first family, well, the first person, the first family, the first rebellion, the first falling away, all of that, first sin, all of that is in Genesis. So that means that if you are reading the Bible, you want to find out, well, how did we get separated from God? How did sin happen? You wouldn't start reading in the book of, you wouldn't start reading in Hebrew like we started reading about the chapters and verses, because there wouldn't be nothing in there about what happened. You have to go back to the beginning. And it gives the basis of everything. It's a jumping off point. If we want to start off with what the Bible is about, who is it addressing, what happened, we have to go to Genesis. Questions, comments? Now, it is a lengthy book, and it's a whole lot of genealogy. You got to find out who begat who, and who, where did this start, and how did we get this way, and how did we go that way? All of it is accounted for in the book of Genesis. You have to take some time to go through Genesis. That's why I say a person who is starting out reading the Bible, Genesis is not the first book you need to read. I know it's the first book in the Bible. That's not the first book you need to start reading if you're just trying to get used to reading the Bible, because it will make you want to stop reading. It will cause you to not want to read the Bible, because it's long and it gets boring. It's a lot of stuff in there. Yeah, it's in there for your benefit, but it may not be need to be the first book that you need to read if you're starting to read the Bible. You understand? I know it's the first book, but it may not be the first book you need to read if you want to start reading the Bible. I always recommend, if you want to really start reading the Bible, you need to go and read the Gospel according to St. John, a New Testament book, because he's the one that starts out telling you the same thing that's in Genesis, because it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. So it's telling you the story of Jesus, but it started with the beginning. In fact, if you read a Greek translation of the Gospel of John, it will have Genesis in there, because it says in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. All right, that's for your benefit. Questions, comments? Now, keeping in mind, Genesis is the beginning, and it's the only dependable record that talks about the beginning of humanity. A whole lot of times, like I said, if you started reading Genesis, you would get hung up, and you would get, I would say, I hate to use the word bored when you're reading the Bible, but for some people, it will become boring because it goes to a lot of narrative. But the narrative is going to be beneficial once you get a knowledge of the rest of the Bible. Then you're going to have to go back and read Genesis to know, why are we talking about this group? Why are we talking about this family? So you would have to go back and read Genesis just to find out what you know now. You know a whole lot of stuff now, and you keep hearing about the children of Israel and how they are blessed and all of that. Well, go back to Genesis and find out why. 12th chapter of Genesis will tell you exactly why. That was a blessing, a promise came from God to Abraham. And that's why throughout, whenever you read the New Testament and you hear people talking about the New Testament and the people who arguing with Jesus, they always say, we the children of Abraham. That's something special about us. All right, so you find out what's so special about them when you read Genesis. So I'm telling you that even though you can start reading the book of John to find out who Jesus is and what his relationship to us is, once you get all of that, then you want to go back and find out all this stuff you've been hearing about Moses and all the stuff you keep hearing about Adam and Eve and all that. It makes you want, yeah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, that's where they start at in Genesis. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And Jacob's name was changed to Israel. And he had 12 sons, the 12 tribes of Israel. They still over there fighting. They still over there fighting. They were fighting in Genesis. So, and they still fighting. And they still waiting on Jesus to come, their Messiah to come back. Because when they come back, they're going to be top of the world. Because that's what they misinterpret the promise. The promise is that the children of Abraham will be blessed. And they will be blessed until the end of time. I believe the end of time is when Jesus comes back. When he comes back, then the clock stops. You don't need a clock after that. In fact, you don't need a sunset and a sunrise anymore when Jesus comes back. So that is the fulfillment of the promise. Now, he's given everybody until he came back to get a right relationship with him. So that means that all of those children of Abraham who said Jesus is their father and all of that, and he's their Lord, if they haven't accepted him before then, their promise has been fulfilled. As long as they were here on earth, they were blessed. All of Abraham's children, as long as they're here on earth, they're blessed until the end of time. When the end of time comes, if they haven't accepted Jesus, they go with the rest of the people who did not receive him. And your birthright as children of Abraham does not give you a pardon, and your sentence is not commuted just because you're a child of Abraham. Okay, and let me keep on talking because I don't want to talk about too many books on the same night. So we're going to keep right on a little bit with Genesis. We know that the writer of Genesis is who? All right, I would hope that everybody would kind of know that. The writer of Genesis is who? Is Moses. And some would say, well, how can Moses write about Adam and Eve and Moses and all of them folks like that when he wasn't there? And we acknowledge that he had a close relationship with God. When we read his story, actually, his story, the story of Moses, is not in Genesis. Y'all got that? His story is not in Genesis. His story is going to be in another book. But because of the fact we know his story, how that he met Jesus at the burning bush, and he told him to take off his shoes, you're on hollow ground. He stayed up there with Moses and talked and whatever and sent Moses back. We saw that in the movie, right? It looked like he got old all of a sudden when he went up to talk with God. He came back and had white hair. But keep in mind, when we read the story of Moses, Moses was probably 80 years old when he had this great conversation with God. And he had already been in that region 40 years. And so when God sent him back to Egypt to tell Pharaoh to let his people go, he was 80 years old. All right, which really, didn't mean nothing then, considering the fact that his story says that his eyes were not dimmed and he was still, in other words, he didn't have nothing wrong with him that would kill him. He didn't have nothing wrong with him that would cause his health to demise. In fact, they don't know they didn't say he died of anything because he was in good health when he died. And they said the Lord took him. That's all we know about him because nobody didn't bury him. That's a whole nother story, but we'll get to that when we get to him. Questions, comments. I like to open up questions and comments that make you want to come back. So Moses is the author, and he had divine knowledge from God. God told him all that he needed to know, and he ends up writing the first 5 books of the Bible, which we call the Pentateuch, which we later call the law. the 5 books of Moses, the law. And that law, those 5 books, were the whole Bible. For the children of Israel, that was their whole Bible. That was it. The law, that's all they talked about was the law. All the rest of the things that we know about came later. They had the 5 books of law going through, once they got through the desert, and by the time they got over the mountains, and by the time they got to the river Jordan, they had the law. When they got to the promised land, they had the law. That's all they had. Now, once we go further, we'll find out they had to, now that they have the law, what are you going to do with it? That's where we get the history. We got this law, and we're in this land that God gave us. He promised to Abraham. We got it, and we got the law. This is what we're supposed to go by. Now that God has given us this land, of course, they didn't follow the law. But so that the first book of the law would be Genesis. Moses had divine guidance from God. No man was still living who would have known all that happened with Adam, except God told him. And so the other thing about Moses and his ability to be able to write is that he was educated as a prince. People have to understand that. Y'all seen the cartoon with, they did make that Moses the Prince of Egypt. The Prince of Egypt was Moses. He was a prince. He was raised up as a prince. That's the real story. They scooped him out of the river, but that was intended. They put him there because they knew that the Pharaoh's daughter was going to be hanging around there. And she raised him up just like it was her son. He was raised up as a prince. And a prince is prepared to be the king, the ruler. So he was prepared. He knew everything there was to know about all of the education that was available to the Egyptian people. And we know now that the Egyptian people were the most educated people of the world. They got some stuff they knew that we still don't know. We don't know how they made pyramids. We don't know how they took hearts out and lungs out and put them in jars and put them in solutions, and they still got them. And how they mummified people. We don't know how they did it. We don't know how they made pyramids without any modern. They don't have no bulldozers and caterpillars, and they could make all that stuff with their brain power. They had manpower, but they had to have some brain power to be able to put that stuff together. Even though they used millions, thousands of people to work, it still took them years to do this, and we don't know how. They didn't leave the how-to book instructions on how to make a pyramid and why they did all this stuff. But nevertheless, that's what we're going to find out as we continue onward. So Genesis would be the first book. And, of course, it traces everything from the beginning of Adam and Eve, keeping in mind that Adam and Eve had more than 2 children. And that's why some people quit reading the Bible when they see Adam and Eve having 2 children and one of them killed the other one. They say, well, there ain't no need of me reading the Bible because the Bible talks about all these people in the world, where they come from, but they ain't have but 2 children, one of them got killed. I mean, that's a legitimate, yeah. But that's when they stop reading. They don't read the rest of it. It says in the next line, there was a son named Seth, and he had, and Adam and Eve had many sons and daughters. I don't know how many years. And you live 930 years, and this whole country, this whole North American continent, a civilization hasn't been here but 600 years. Consider that. Well, yeah, about it. If they started coming here in 1619, that's when Jamestown and Plymouth Rock, 1620, and here we are, 2025. How many years is that? 500-600 years? That's all this, and Adam lived 930 years. And we think of course, incest now. That they never talk about incest in the Bible until after they wrote the law. All right, now that's a whole nother story. Because that was a thing then, and I'm going to tell you this, and then I'm going to close. If Cain was outlawed from the community, God still protected him so that nobody could take his life. I'm going to tell you this. He had to, over that 900-year period he was living, that means he had to have kidnapped his sisters, his cousins, his nieces, and made him a whole tribe just like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's where we get gypsies, tramps, and thieves. Okay. That's all I'm going to say tonight. Deacon Noble, if you can give us a word of prayer. Go ahead, go right ahead. Mm-hmm. That is that's the beginning book, right, the book. And that's the book that we need to get started. Okay. Reverend John, if you could lead us in a closing word. Did I say you first? I said you first, but your prayer didn't get DC 1, so it didn't let DC win. So we're gonna let him have it tonight. Some of y'all didn't get that.
Amen.
Yeah, Lord.
Father, we thank you for all that you've done. We thank you for all that you allowed us to go on tonight. We thank you, God, put it back in our placement, Lord, we may be able to receive. And God, we'll study it.
Have your way, Lord.
In Jesus' name we do pray.
Amen. Glad you all could come tonight, and hopefully we will encourage you to come back again, to study, to be approved unto God, become in other words, study to show ourselves approved to become a workman who need not be ashamed.